I'm Chris Motes, and this is Faith in Politics. On this broadcast, we range from the soul to the state as we cultivate those virtues and explore those principles that help us live well as faithful Catholics in this great land. Hey, well, welcome back for another episode, folks. We are broadcasting from the great state of South Dakota, where under God, the people rule. It is back to school time. I want to invite you to go back to school with the South Dakota Catholic Conference. We are launching a statewide book club reading group. We're going to be meeting via Zoom on Wednesday nights at 8:15 Central, 7:15 Mountain Time, beginning on September 8th. It's Wednesday next week. If you want in or if you want more details, you can reach out via the website, sdcatholicconference.org. Click Contact Us, and I'll send you all the information you need. We're going to be opening with a great book by Joseph Pieper. It's called Joseph Pieper, an Anthology. Joseph Pieper was a great German Thomist who kind of explained some of the theology of philosophy of Thomas Aquinas and who built on Aristotle, as we've discussed in this program in the past. Spending 6 weeks with this Joseph Pieper anthology, then going through Veritatis Splendor, a book I'm really excited about, Prayer as a Political Problem by the French Jesuit Jean Cardinal Danilou. Then a collection of speeches by Alexander Solzhenitsyn in a book titled Warning to the West, and then ending with Social Justice Isn't What You Think It Is in the Christmas season. That's a book by Michael Novak. So if you want more information or just to learn a little more, feel free to reach out via the website. Okay, now we're going back to school right now, again, with regular guest, Professor Jon Schaff, who is well known to listeners of this program, professor of political science at Northern State University, author of a number of books, and writer of fine articles that appear at your local, your favorite, some of your favorite websites out there. Professor Schaff, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me, Chris. Can't wait.
So our topic today, I think, one that you suggested, and I think is timely, just as Afghanistan is in people's consciousness, and we're just sort of starting to think about our own role in the world as Americans. But the topic for us today is just war theory. This theory developed, I think, the first, and you'll tell us more, going all the way back to St. Augustine. We've spent a lot of time talking about him too, a City of God.
Yep.
But really, really interesting topic for me, kind of near to my own heart too, as a veteran, former Marine. But let's dive right in. Where do we start with just war theory?
Well, I think you're right, Chris, that you could start from Augustine, so 5th century AD, of course, and then over the course of medieval and early modern times, the theory gets fleshed out by many thinkers. There's actually a very healthy, relatively contemporary school or scholars of just war theory, such as the philosopher Michael Walzer has a very famous book called Just and Unjust Wars, and he's not arguing from the Catholic tradition, but still I think it's a very good book on the subject if listeners were looking for kind of a brief and very, very readable primer on just war theory. It's a place to go. Other than you could also seek out more Catholic sources. But I think when we start talking about just war theory, there are two concepts that we have to start with, and one is when is it just to go to war? And so we call that is jus ad bellum, right? When is it just to go to war? And then there's jus in bello, which is justice in war, of war. So once a war is started, how do we conduct the war in a just manner? So two things. When is it just to go to war? And then second, once we're in war, what does justice mean within the context of fighting the war? How do we fight that justly? And so I guess we could probably start at the start, right? Which is when is it just to go to war? And I'll try to go through these quickly, and you feel free to butt in whenever you think it's appropriate. I don't want this to be a lecture.
No. Well,
so,
and just kind of an etymological note for listeners, that those words bello, bellum, just think like bellicose. If somebody's bellicose, they're sort of, they're in a fighting spirit. So that's our word for war. Yep. So we've got sort of justice before war. So the principles leading us up to a decision of whether to go to war, and then use in bellum or bello. I'm not a Latin scholar. That would be sort of the rules of conduct during a war. How do you treat prisoners? How do you pick targets, engage targets, et cetera, et cetera. So take it from there.
Yeah, and so when we start talking about the first thing, when it's just to go to war, Uh, Most just war theorists say that you need to have first a just cause, and that the basic just cause is self-defense against aggression. The problem we have is, what is aggression? Um, Everyone would agree that a direct invasion, what we call a border crossing, that's aggression. If Canada invaded the United States, that's aggression, and the United States has the right to repulse that aggression. But then there are things that would be below that. Things like there's some people say that an insult against national honor is aggression. There's what back in Woodrow Wilson's presidency, he threatened war against the Mexicans because they failed to raise flags and fire cannons when the American Navy went by. That'd be a low standard. That would not have been just if he would have done that, but just an example. Things like trade embargoes or sanctions or blockades. So there's a reason, for example, Chris, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, John F. Kennedy called what we did to Cuba when we surrounded Cuba with our Navy and only let certain ships go through. They called that a quarantine, because if they would have called it what it was, a blockade, that would be an act of war.
Yeah.
So they chose a euphemism, the blockade. Then things like what we call anticipation. We might think of, it'd be one way to justify, for example, United States actions in Iraq in 2003. So the question here is, what if you know someone's going to attack you?
Yeah, they've got scuds and they're pointed at us, and we think that they're going to launch them.
And so, think of the analogy: if I insult Chris and I say, "Chris, I'm going to punch you," and I pull my fist back, would Chris, if Chris is quick on with his fist, would he be justified in punching me before I punch him? I mean, I've announced an intention. I've made active preparation. I'm pulling my fist back. At that point, we'd say, what I've done is actually an aggression.
Yeah. There's an imminency to the blow landing on my cheek.
Yeah. And so I think, some would argue whether that befits the 2003 invasion of Iraq. That's one of the ways in which the Bush administration argued that, because perhaps a certain kind of regime having certain kinds of weapons is itself an act of aggression. I mean, people can argue that, but I think probably the classic case of an anticipation would be the Israeli Arab 1967 Six Days War, when the Israelis attacked before they were attacked, because they had intelligence. Air forces were sorties were being sent out. Right, they knew it was coming, and so they attacked first. Another possible conundrum is what we call intervention. Again, just to use kind of a homey example.
Yeah.
If your neighbor is getting beaten up in a fight, do you just have to stand there and watch?
Right.
Right. At what point do you gain the right to intervene? Okay, so let's use an actual international example. Let's say there's genocide going on in the Sudan.
Right.
Do we have the right to intervene as a third party to stop that genocide? And again, this is when it starts to get hairy, because what constitutes a genocide? When there is a massive violation of human rights, and this, of course, goes partially to the decision to leave or stay in Afghanistan. We know that in leaving, there's going to be massive abuses of human rights. We know that's going to happen. And so if we can use the well-honed phrase from Spider-Man, the first Tobey Maguire Spider-Man, and all the iterations, with great power comes great responsibility. Because the United States has the ability to stop those human rights abuses, do we have the right, or possibly even the duty, to intervene to stop those human rights abuses? Because you see, what the problem here is that we would now be violating Afghanistan's sovereignty.
Right.
So at what point does a country lose its sovereign rights? Because what they're doing within its borders, whether it's a genocide, human rights abuses, possibly a civil war, is so awful that third parties gain the right to come in in what we would normally recognize as a violation of sovereignty.
Yeah, and I think Colin Powell called that the Pottery Barn rule. You remember this?
Yeah.
Yeah, you break it,
Yep.
you buy it. So,
Yeah.
once the decision has been made, okay, we're going to enter this country, or, but okay, that's kind of water under the bridge. But now we actually have certain obligations to pay for the damaged goods, so to speak, moving forward. We have
Yeah. Yep.
obligations unto this particular situation. So, intervention, that's the principle.
Yeah. Yep. So all that we've talked about so far all comes under, believe it or not, one thing: just cause.
Just
When is
cause.
it just to go to war? Right? You have to have a just cause.
Yep.
A second principle is proper authority, and this is if you are looking for a contemporary Catholic source, I've read George Weigel on this subject. War is a public act; it is not a private act, right? So I, as an individual, can't decide I'm at war against Afghanistan, right? It's got to be the act of a proper authority, which we normally consider the sovereign authority. The sovereign has the right to decide whether you're at war or not and to start war. So, and then this becomes, in our day, what becomes kind of the monkey wrench in this is things like, can a UN resolution justify war?
Yeah.
When the UN doesn't have any sovereign authority. And we've seen that, especially more so in the first Iraq war in 1991. Now, first President Bush ultimately got congressional authority, but he said that his authority to go to war came from the United Nations. Harry Truman said the same thing in Korea in 51,
Yeah.
1950.
Yeah.
Going to war in Korea was based on executing UN resolutions as opposed to American constitutional processes.
Yeah.
It would require some act of Congress, a declaration of war, or at least an authorization, which again, President Bush ultimately got that in 1991, but he said that he didn't need it.
Yeah.
And that's again where you get a question of what is the proper authority.
Well, and I suppose this could be a bit murky too in places where maybe there's some contest. The island of Taiwan comes to mind. I think we would all recognize it's self-governing, but the very large nation of China would disagree with that assertion, I suppose.
When you don't recognize people's a nation's right to exist, which is
Right.
precisely the somewhat ambiguous situation with Taiwan, or until relatively recently, legions of countries that refuse to recognize Israel's right to exist,
Right.
And did not recognize the Israeli government's sovereignty. Forget about the occupied areas, even Israel proper.
Sure.
So you've got just cause, proper authority. The third thing is right intention, and this is where we can go to Augustine. Augustine says that the aim of war is to restore the tranquility of order. Something is out of order, and we need to restore that order. So therefore, war for profit or land is not just. Now, you might get profit or land out of it as a happenstance, right?
Yeah.
Or maybe as part of a peace agreement as a punitive damage against somebody. But the aim of war cannot be to gain land. So, like, for example, in American history, the Mexican-American War in the 1840s becomes suspect because, frankly, it was a relatively obvious land grab, where the cause of war was basically ginned up by the United States as an excuse to take land successfully, as it turns out, from the Mexicans. So that's a dubious intention on the part of the United States. Or we think, classically, Hitler invading Poland, would be an example of that. You're going to war simply to take somebody's land. And then we start to get into areas, Chris, that are, you're going to see it. I'll make a point of this at the end. Some of this is murky.
Yeah.
Because our fourth principle is a reasonable chance of success.
Yeah.
Well, what's a reasonable chance of success? That there's no algorithm that tells us what that is. So, because what we don't want is to engage in a war where there's needless death. There's got to be some hope of success. Though even here, you might ask questions. There's such thing as going down fighting. You're going to lose, but maybe there's something heroic. in going down fighting. That's a possibility.
So we could say
Uh,
that the virtue of prudence is actually really important to analyzing
yes,
these factors.
and and that's about, maybe I'll just make the point now then, Chris, is because I'm going through a list here,
Yeah,
right?
right.
I've gone through points 1 through 4. Is we can't think of just war theory as a checklist where if I because when I'm done here with justice of going to war, you're going to notice there's going to be seven points. If I get 5 out of 7, uh, it's just, I'm going down a checklist. What these are guidelines, um, to to give a statesman some information that he can use to make a prudent decision. There's a contemporary just war scholar, who I'm now going to forget whether it's Daniel or David Bell, who said one time, it's sort of like he said when he was teaching like a Sunday school or a kind of a religious education to a group of high school kids, and he said, the first time to think about morality of sex is not when you're in the back seat of the car,
Mm,
right? You need to have thought about this
yes.
beforehand. The time to think about just war is before you are faced with it. And so a statesman needs to be thinking about these things. And there's going to be a lot of prudence, a lot of judgment involved here. For example, again, the 5th point, the use of arms cannot produce an evil greater than the one being eliminated. That's proportionality. Well, evil greater, right? How do we know? And part of that is anticipation, or we don't necessarily know what's going to happen in war. So it's something that you have to use a judgment, or even more so. There's the 6th point is, war should be a last resort. Well, what's the last resort? There's always something else you could do. I mean, for one thing, you could surrender. You could capitulate. There's always something you can do instead of war. The question is, at what point is that something just delaying or denying what is inevitable, namely war?
Mm.
So a statesman has to figure out anything. And think of President Bush number 2, going to war in Iraq. You know, how many resolutions from the United Nations are necessary, right? How many allies do you need? How many warnings to Iraq do you need to give before you say we've done enough? There's nothing more that we could do that would actually that would actually help us towards the restoration of order, the tranquility of order.
Yep.
There's only one more thing to do, and that's a matter of prudence. And I lied. There's not 7 points. There's 6 points. I forgot.
That's it.
So that's it.
So the last
Those
point
are
is last resort.
Liz last resort. Yes. So my last one was last resort. So our 6 points are, just cause, proper authority, right intention, reasonable chance of success, proportionality, and then finally war should be the last resort, whatever last means.
Yeah. And just kind of speaking from my Marine background too, this whole use in bellum, excuse me, sort of during the conduct of war, you talk about practicing and sort of rehearsing and sort of training ahead of time. It's something that Marines did all the time. We kind of these no shoot drills.
Yep.
Just applying principles of, one of the principles for the conduct of war would be a principle of discriminating between lawful military targets and not lawful targets. So it's something Marines practice all the time. I really appreciate, Professor, how you kind of bring up the necessity for statesmen, for policymakers, for competent political authorities to actually be forming their minds in the exercise of some of these principles, even before they ever get to the backseat of the car, right?
Oh, yeah, and let's not excuse ourselves as well.
Right.
There's a reason why we're doing this podcast. It's not simply for our Joint Chiefs of Staff, who I hope are listening, but the general population needs to be thinking about these things. And obviously the church has a robust tradition of thinking about war. And so, I know you and I have talked in the past about conscience, and one of the things that makes a conscience a rightly formed conscience is I've used the analogy of it's like a muscle. You have to exercise that muscle. You have to be thinking about things and studying. And so when you make a choice, your conscience is well formed. And this goes to even as citizens, especially here in a democracy where what's our state motto, Chris? Under God, the people rule.
Yeah.
So the people rule. So that means that we have to form our consciences too. And so we need to be thinking about war as well. Not that the state of South Dakota goes to war, not a proper sovereign, but the United States does. But you sort of anticipated, Chris, we're going to move beyond when is it just to go to war. We're going to talk about what is justice in war. And you mentioned in your Marine training, right? This is what, when you're actually conducting war, what are some principles that govern us?
Yeah.
And you mentioned discrimination, right? So we have to discriminate between who's a combatant and who's not a combatant. And here I like to use a boxing ring analogy, which I'm sure I've stolen from someone and I've long forgotten who it's from. But we all know that once you get inside the ring, it's okay for the other guy to punch you.
Right.
Right. So in some, I think it was Napoleon who said that soldiers were made to die. Now that's a bit harsh, but I think we know that there's at least a partial truth to that. But the question is, again, who's a combatant? So even with people in uniform, is a prisoner a combatant? Is someone who's wounded a combatant? How wounded do they have to be before they're no longer a threat? This is to say nothing of civilians, but what if I'm a civilian who works in a munitions factory?
Yep.
Am I a target? If I work on the electrical grid, am I a target?
Yeah.
So, in fact, I'd be kind of curious about what your shoot no shoot situations, your training, Chris, about how they help you with that to make those. Because again, you don't want to find yourself in the heat of battle, never having thought about what is the right time to pull the trigger.
That's right. Yeah, it's and something we haven't talked about yet is, going back to Augustine. Certainly, Augustine, in developing this theory, he's 1100 years before the Treaty of Westphalia, but there's certainly this concept of political authority, and then 1648 we had to get sort of the rise of the nation state. But now we're in a period in which the nation state no longer has a monopoly on violence. So one of the things that the Marines were training is, okay, we're not talking about distinguishing between somebody in a uniform and a non-combatant. We're talking about distinguishing between legitimate combatant targets, but they're not wearing uniforms, and then somebody who's, we'd be looking for things like, have we witnessed a hostile act? Have we witnessed hostile intent? Can we articulate those things? Can we see
I'm really glad you brought that up, because one of the things that I want to talk about and forgot about until you brought that up is precisely that the rules I'm talking about here did arise in the age when it was assumed that the people involved in war are nation states. So it's one army versus another army. But these days, of course, we would talk about asymmetrical warfare. And of course, we see this in Afghanistan. Now, granted, the Taliban now has taken over, so they now have quasi-official status, I suppose. But you're oftentimes in contemporary warfare, you're going against groups like, say, Al-Qaeda, who is a supranational organization. They don't represent a nation state.
Right.
And so you often have, and the whole point of these things, of this kind of asymmetrical warfare, is to muddy the waters as to who's a combatant, who is not a combatant, to put your enemy sort of on their heels, to make them hesitate. And so the rise of terrorism, or even when there was a change in war, when war became not two armies meeting on a battlefield and running at each other, but war becomes urban. Yep. It takes place where people live, or we get the concept of total war.
Yes.
Where people start to realize, maybe I can't beat the army, but if I scare the heck out of the population, maybe they'll just quit. And so now I start to see civilians as a legitimate target, because if the civilians experience enormous, they get what we call war weariness. They get weary, tired of war. maybe the other side will just give up. Now, we would say targeting civilians, with one exception. We can maybe talk about the concept of double effect here in a second. But on the rule is, with some exceptions, that civilians are not legitimate targets, but not everybody. There's an old German general, General von Moltke. There's two General von Moltkes. I think this is the first one, the father, who was late 19th century. There was also a son who served in the First World War, but justice of war is getting it over quickly.
Yes.
And so anything that gets war over quickly is just. Now, that's not true, but one can sort of see the logic behind it. That anything sort of short of something truly shocking is just because. And so if going after civilians gets it over with quickly, that might actually save lives.
The ends justify the means.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Which is not true.
We would always, you can't get to the army through the military, through civilians, and with some minor exceptions, which maybe we can talk about.
Yeah, let's talk about those a little bit, because this whole idea of total war, and just I'm going to drop this in there for listeners that want to kind of look this stuff up. You're going to go to your catechism and look up paragraph 2309, and kind of right around there is where some of these principles are unpacked a little bit. But it cites to this section of the catechism cites to Gaudium et Spes, the sort of constitution for the church in the modern world, adopted by the Council Fathers at the Second Vatican Council, and they discuss total war with some depth. They're writing in the 60s. The experience of World War II, which was a total war, is still, I think, fresh in their minds. They would have been middle-aged, I suppose, during World War II, and they say no to total war. And it's kind of a new thing too. So let's talk about that a little bit, John. What do we need to know about the destruction of innocent life in war, and when it would be okay, according to the church's teaching, in some very limited circumstances, to accept civilian deaths as with foreknowledge ahead of time that those deaths will result? What's the principle here?
Yeah. Well, I think I like use of the word accept. It's not the purpose; it's a secondary effect. So we call this the concept of double effect. So the classic situation is, what if civilians are involved in the war effort? Like I said previously, you're working in a munitions factory. So the munitions factory is a legitimate war target. We know that when we drop, say, a bomb or a missile on the munitions factory, that civilians are going to die. And so we say that blowing up that munitions factory has a double effect. It has two effects. One, it destroys a legitimate military target. The second effect is the killing of civilians. And this is normally considered just as long as the purpose of the attack is not to kill civilians. And so, for example, carpet bombing of Dresden in the Second World War by the Allies is questionable in this sense, because it was precisely just simply trying to, the Germans bombing London. Let's blame the Germans first, because Dresden in some respects is a response. Germans are clearly targeting London, especially once they develop V1 and V2 missiles. They're targeting civilians as a way to try to defeat Allied, specifically British morale. And one of the responses to that is the carpet bombing of Dresden. Well, that's targeting civilians.
Yep.
And that's not just. Now, you can attack legitimate military targets with, as you put it, the foreknowledge that some civilians, some non-combatants who would normally be considered outside the boxing ring are going to die. But that's not the purpose of the attack.
Yeah, and maybe a good example of this too, just within our own nation's history, are the attacks on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And sometimes this is hard to process and think about, because there was such great relief, I think, collectively for our nation, like, oh, the war's over. We brought an end to the war. But in fact, it was deliberately targeting civilian populations just for the sake of exerting this new weapon over the Japanese populace.
Yeah, so Hiroshima and Nagasaki are questionable in two sense. One for what you just said, is that it was targeting civilians. So there are people who argue that Japan was so militarized that there was no such thing as a non-military target
Hmm.
in Japan. And I don't agree with that, but I think it's a credible argument. I take it seriously. But the second thing is, another principle of jus in bello is proportionality, which is confusing because we talk about proportionality in going to war.
Yes.
But also, here what we mean by proportionality is using as much force necessary as to achieve victory. And there are some who say that some weapons, what we call weapons of mass destruction, are never proportional, and that would include nuclear weapons. And there was a time when, this is way back in the 1980s, when the American Catholic bishops got, I have to reach the recess of my mind, but certainly very close to saying the use of nuclear weapons would never be justified, precisely because a nuclear weapon is so indiscriminate
Yeah.
that you can't. It's not precise. It's inevitable. You're going to be killing non-military folks. And same thing with things like biological and chemical weapons. Is they can be so indiscriminate that they are never in proportion, or they cause so much damage that it's never in proportion to what you're trying to achieve. Again, people can argue that, because again, proportionality is to some extent is something that requires prudence. How much is enough to achieve victory, especially in the American context, the so-called Powell Doctrine? I mean, you referenced the "if you break it, you bought it." Colin Powell also said you always attack with overwhelming force.
Yeah.
You don't want to leave anything to chance. And there's obviously militarily, there's a good deal of prudence behind that statement.
Yeah, but the principle proportionality, to just maybe sharpen the point for listeners too. So think of like, okay, we figured out where Osama bin Laden is. He's clearly, instigating violence against America. He has in the past. We think he's still planning attacks. We're not going to drop a nuke on the whole city in which he's got this hideout. There's something very proportional about, okay, we're sending in the SEAL team and they're going to go do their thing.
Yep.
But we're not leveling the city. It's a proportional approach. But, well,
Yeah. Well, and this is one of the problems that if we're up against time, we can
no,
stop.
go ahead, please.
I was just going to say, I can make this point really quick. It's one of the problems of modern technological warfare, especially thinking of things like drone strikes, is that often targets are picked at a distance.
Yeah.
And the thing about, like you mentioned, Osama bin Laden with sending in SEAL Team 6, is they are right there. There's a human on the ground picking out a target. And sometimes perhaps you run into moral issues. I'm not saying it's immoral, but there are moral issues involved when you're using missile strikes targeted by satellites. And even though the technology is extremely sophisticated, but it's not as sophisticated as a human on the ground with eyeballs.
That's
But
right.
obviously we like to use this technology because that human on the ground with eyeballs is now himself a target. And this is a way of protecting those people. We can do this at a distance, but that creates its own problems.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think another thing too, and I know this is not one of the 6 factors of, you said bellum, or even conduct of war, but with drone strikes and in this technology where we can sort of kill from a distance, I think there's something too that, especially in a republic like America, where we're citizens, really, it's our we bear moral responsibility for these actions of our country. When we don't have skin in the game, so to speak, with our brothers and sisters, our neighbors, actually sort of being so there. I think you're right that there's very much this discrimination aspect of eyeballs that can actually see things in a better way. But I'd also, I don't know, and this is just my own thought here, is that it contributes to the seriousness of what's happening. It's a very, very serious thing. So, okay, we are at 34 minutes right now, Dr. Schaff, which is just fine for folks listening on the radio. Glad you've jumped over and finished this out on the podcast platform. Anything else we should cover before we wrap it up?
Boy, I hope not. We've talked long enough, haven't we?
We
I was
have.
just going to say on the lines, you know,
Oh, Dr. Schaff, we're losing you. Can you say again?
smart weapons, smart as we think they are. I'll just say smart weapons aren't as smart as we think they are. And sometimes we do have that kind of, the technology can give this illusion of distance, which um, maybe causes us to dehumanize the people who are involved in war. Even if there are enemies, they're still humans.
Right.
And when targets become simply blips on a screen like it's a video game, and I think this technology has all sorts of benefits. I'm just saying that a morally serious people have to think about how we go about waging war, and the like in all aspects of life. The rise of technology solves certain problems while creating other problems, and we need to think about. I think it's easy to figure out what problems are solved by smart military technology. We have to think about a little bit about what problems are created by that smart technology. And part of that is the
Yeah.
tendency that war in essence becomes too clean, too surgical, too antiseptic. And maybe
Yeah.
we don't want to lose all of that because it makes it less morally serious than it actually is.
Yeah. Dr. Schaff, this was just a great conversation. Thank you, as always, for joining us on the show.
You you bet. I appreciate it.
And listeners, I'm going to close it out with this, just because we've kind of been talking about some heavy stuff. And so from this section on the Catechism, I just want to read a little bit about what's kind of happening in the heart here. This is paragraph 2303. Catechism says, deliberate hatred is contrary to charity. Hatred of the neighbor is a sin when one deliberately wishes him evil. Hatred of the neighbor is a grave sin when one deliberately desires him grave harm. So when we're kind of talking about just war and the principles of war, and it's just so important that we give ourselves to the Lord, and we just invite him to cast out any hatred that might have crept into our hearts, and to restore our own brokenness with his divine charity. So thanks so much for joining. Again, if you're interested in the book club, don't hesitate to reach out. And I think Dr. Schaff used this image of, we got to exercise. It's like kind of a muscle. It's like, so we go to the gym, get healthy, we're going to work out. So this book club can be a little bit like a muscle, or exercising our reason. So don't hesitate to reach out. We'd love to have you join us again, beginning September 8th, Wednesday evening next week. Thanks for joining us this week. Until next time, live well.